This middle class of professionals and technicians and smaller businessmen, doctors, lawyers, teachers, preachers, brokers, clerks, engineers, etc., are not only paid and allowed to make more money than the poor, but are also allowed to own more things like finer houses, better cars, color TVs, hi-fis, nicer clothes, and eat more and better food, etc., to try to keep them happy so they won't rebel against the rich whom they serve, even though they're smart enough to do so. This partly rich middle class of workers, scientists, technicians, professionals, etc., because they are so well paid and given so many things and allowed to live so comfortably, they help the rich to keep the poor in their place on the bottom so they won't rebel against being slaves of the rich, as they are also the slaves of the middle class, who are a sort of semi-rich or half-rich, known as the bourgeoisie or intelligentsia, intellectuals, professionals, small businessmen, etc. This half-rich middle class are all the same as the very rich to most of the very poor of the world, since the middle class is rich compared to the poor, so that the slightly richer middle class and the very rich upper class who govern them are all the same to the very poor who serve them as their servants and slaving laborers. To the poor man who is trying to earn enough to get enough food, clothing, and shelter together to keep the body and spirit of himself and his family together and alive, the rich and the middle class are all the same. They are all his masters, and he their slave. The police and army, too, look to him like nothing but the tools of the rich and middle class who make the laws and enforce them to protect themselves and keep him under and in subjection so he can't rebel or riot or revolt for his rights or strike for higher wages or demand better housing and living conditions or more food and better clothing. So that the courts and prisons are naturally loaded and filled to overflowing with many more of the poor and very few of the middle class and almost none of the very rich, who, after all, are themselves the government and the law and its enforcers, and are always excused or buy their way out, even if they do happen to run into trouble with the lower classes for robbing or cheating them or even killing them. The rich seldom have trouble in the courts, except with other rich or richer governments, for the laws and courts and governments are made by the rich, for the rich, and to protect the rich, so they can stay rich and powerful and continue to oppress the poor, their slaves and servants. Of course, some say that the very rich and powerful and intelligent upper class and the semi-so-middle class are needed to direct and manage the labor of the poor man who doesn't really know what's good for him or how to manage himself and his own affairs, so they must do it for him. So as long as he is fed, clothed, and housed with the barest necessities, and doesn't have to slave too hard to earn them, the poor are usually content or made to be content and conditioned to be satisfied by the system of rich that rule them, so there will be no strikes or riots or rebellions, and everybody will be comfortable and peaceful and fairly happy, except for the rich. The rich are never comfortable enough, seldom peaceful, and hardly ever happy. So since they got rich in the first place, thinking that more things and more power would make them happier, and yet they're still not happy, they are continually seeking even more things and even more power to try to be more happy. But this actually makes them even more unhappy, because they have to break God's loving laws of equality and sharing to do it. And since they do not dare to take more, or at least not much more, from the middle class, whom they must try to keep happy lest they rebel against them, there's only one class left that they can both oppress and rob and cheat and even slaughter if necessary, to keep themselves in power and make themselves richer than ever. And that's the poor man, the pitifully poor underdog, who can never see any way to get out of his dilemma, and so is just thankful if he manages to stay alive. But when the rich and semi-rich begin to pass the buck of more taxes, harder labor, higher prices, and worse conditions onto him, Mr. Poorman, it begins to be almost too much for him to bear. So he starts striking and rioting and demonstrating in protest to get a little more of what's coming to him, at least his poor little share of his actual needs. And if these needs are not met, and he and his family are actually hungry or starving or freezing from the cold, from lack of clothing, fuel, or shelter, Mr. Poorman will sometimes get so desperate just to live, he and his fellows may rise up together and start a great rebellion called a revolution, to overthrow their rich and middle-class oppressors and robbers of the poor, and establish a new government with poor people in power to rule in favor of the poor instead of the rich. These are sometimes called socialist or communist or revolutionary governments, when the poor have had enough and feel it's time for a change. The only trouble is this usually only creates a new class of the newly rich and powerful because of the greedy, evil hearts of men, both rich and poor, so that none are ever satisfied, no matter what they have, without the real love of God in their hearts for their fellow men. So the rich governments, societies, empires come and go, but as Jesus said, the poor ye have always with you. Even under a new government intended to help the poor, some always get rich and powerful and become the new rich, oppressing the new poor. And so it goes on, and we're back to square one again, even when there is a change in some places with some peoples. However, most of the world hasn't changed much, but it just seems that the rich have been moving steadily westward, from the ancient empires of the powerful like Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and Medo-Persia in the east and mid-east, to the succeeding empires of Greece, Rome, Europe, and now America in the west. But once again the winds of change are blowing eastward again. The poor of Russia and China have overthrown their former rich rulers and become the new ruling superpowers of the East, leading many smaller, poorer, third-world nations to do the same in their wake, including many former European and American colonies of the vastly poorer continents of Southern Asia, Africa, South America, and Australia. This new third world of the poor is rising from the ruins of the colonial empires of the North and West, which oppressed and exploited them for centuries. These former colonies now are demanding their human rights to live and to eat and to be clothed and housed and enjoy some of the good things of the so-called good life of their rich neighbors. The poor, laboring toilers of the world of the poor, who through blood, sweat, and tears have for years produced the raw materials from which these things are made by their richer neighbors, are finally demanding a higher share in the enjoyment of these products by insisting on higher wages for their labors and higher prices for their goods. This has helped cause the present wave of worldwide inflation, which simply means a climbing spiral of a vicious cycle of continuously rising prices and wages. Since the rich and the powerful always control the governments and the prices, they keep raising these prices faster than the poor laborers can get their poor wages raised. So Mr. Poorman finds he can never make enough money to get ahead of the rapidly rising prices of the things he needs. And the poorer nations cannot even raise the prices of their raw materials as fast as the richer nations can raise the prices of the finished products, which the rich process and market and sell back to them. So that it causes the rich to get richer and the poor still poorer by comparison, no matter how much more they get for their raw materials and labors. Because the rich industrial nations buy these raw materials from the poor and make them into things wanted by the rich at prices the poor cannot afford. The rich are always clever enough and have enough control of the governments and markets and money to always somehow manage to get the lion's share. For example, no matter how much the farmer gets for his products, and as little as it usually is, by the time the finished products reach the markets where the poor laborer has to buy them back in order to eat, the men in the middle, the rich manufacturers, wholesalers and retailers, and the banks and governments and big money men who finance them, have made most of the money between the poor producer and the poor consumer, who constitute the vast majority of the people. These rich middlemen are like the money changers and makers and buyers and sellers of goods and wares that Jesus drove out of the temple with a whip, overturning their tables and scattering their money because they were polluting his temple and robbing the poor. And the money changers of today have still not changed. They're just the same. They are still polluting man's temple of the earth and robbing its poor of their sacrifices. But the wind of God's whip of judgments is beginning to crack again, and his angry voice is being heard again, and the tables are once more being overturned, as the rich are beginning to themselves be destroyed by their own riches and evil pollution of the earth. The world's worst wasters, like the newly rich United States and Western Europe, are beginning to be buried in their own waste and suffocated by their own befouled air and poisoned by their own polluted waters from the wasteful byproducts of their wanton wastefulness. Their money system is also collapsing because they built it on paper and now even mere electronic impulses instead of real valuables such as the gold and silver from whence it came. The paper empires of the paper tigers of paper money, paper stocks, paper bonds, paper checks, paper securities, paper deeds, and paper contracts are beginning to burn like a wick without the oil and raw goods that used to feed it. Mr. Richman discovered oil in the backyard of Mr. Poorman and traded him paper money for it, so Mr. Richman could burn it wastefully and luxuriously in his rich industries, rich homes, rich cars, trains, and planes, and create a massive mess of plastic luxury products from petrochemicals derived from Mr. Poorman's oil, and upon which the rich world has become so dependent that it thinks it cannot survive without it. But Mr. Poorman, after many years of pumping his precious oil out of his own backyard for poverty-level prices to turn the wheels of Mr. Richman's industries and limousines and plastic toys, has suddenly awakened that he's been selling his precious commodity too cheap, and has been losing his share of its benefits for many years, while Mr. Richman has been getting ever richer on it, as well as wasting it because Mr. Poorman was selling it too cheap. So it has finally dawned on Mr. Poorman that he should raise the price of his oil to what it's really worth, to get back some of his share of the vast riches which his oil has created for Mr. Richman. So Mr. Richman is now furious and screaming that he is being robbed by Mr. Poorman because he can't rob Mr. Poorman any more of his just deserts for his oil. Therefore, Mr. Richman is now yelling for the help of his rich neighbors, whom the oil has also helped to make rich, and is complaining to the rest of the world that Mr. Poorman is now the robber, so they should all help Mr. Richman rob it back again from Mr. Poorman, to whom it really belongs. This is the logic of the rich, that they are always being robbed by the poor, by wages or prices of the poor's services and goods, while it is really the rich who have constantly been robbing the poor of their fair share, as small as it may be. After all, Mr. Richman feels he deserves and needs it all for himself, so why should this little upstart of Mr. Poorman start demanding proper pay for his goods and services? Isn't Mr. Richman the one who is using them and turning them into pleasant products for other rich to enjoy as well? So why should Mr. Poorman suddenly start demanding things he's never even had before, and wealth he's not accustomed to, or a share of the benefits with which he has not formerly been blessed? After all, he's always been poor, so why shouldn't he stay poor and go away and leave his oil alone so Mr. Richman can have it all and stay rich in the riches to which he has been so well accustomed? What right has Mr. Poorman to start demanding enough for his oil, to even be repaid a little of what the rich have robbed him in the past, as well as its present value. But Mr. Richman says that this means we'll have to raise all our prices in order to stay rich, and the other poor people and laborers may not like this and may demand higher wages, which we may have to pay them to keep them alive so they can remain our slaves. This will only speed up this terrible inflationary merry-go-round of higher prices and wages until everybody gets thrown off balance and goes flying through the air in one great crash. But really, Mr. Poorman couldn't care less about the plight Mr. Richman has brought upon himself by robbing Mr. Poorman for so long, so that Mr. Richman made the whole world think he could rob Mr. Poorman forever, while the rich all enjoyed luxuriating in Mr. Poorman's oil, which they were buying for almost nothing, while making vast, fat, rich profits from it for their own pleasure and throwing away the rest, which the poor of the world would have been happy to have if they could. So the poor neighbors of Mr. Poorman are getting together, plus some powerful friends of the poor and enemies of the rich, and saying, "We think you're right, Mr. Poorman, and you have a right to charge whatever you think your oil is worth, and share its benefits, and even get back some of your losses for being cheated so long by the rich. So we'll stand with you, and we just dare the rich to pounce on the poor. We'll help you fight back, and if the rich try any funny stuff, they're going to be the losers this time, and not us poor. It's time for a change, and this time the change is going to be in our favor, and there's going to be a fair share of the world's wealth instead of nearly all of it going into the pockets of the rich and the semi-rich. If not, we'll have to destroy the rich and take over the whole neighborhood of the world ourselves for the benefit of the poor, to save the earth from destruction by the rich. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the world's last ride of the rich to the rear. But there will be no escape for them, as there'll be no place to go, and nowhere to hide, as they can't stop the world and get off, as they'll wish they could. God is about to judge the rich by the poor, as he so often has throughout history, and the rich are about to reap the cruelties and poverties they themselves have sown amongst the poor, while the meek and the poor shall inherit the earth. If you want to know what I mean, just take a look at a world map or globe, and listen to the cries of the poor throughout the earth, to be soon answered by the thunderous judgments of God himself upon the rich nations of the world. While the rich U.S., West, and Israelis are declaring a world war on the poor Arabs to stir up the whole world against them, the poor are this time refusing to back down. "Let 'em come," said one Arab. "We'll boil 'em in oil." In the recent Arab Summit Conference in Rabat, Morocco, the Arabs united unanimously in a solid Arab wall against their enemies, and gave official recognition of the rights of the poor Palestinians to their homeland, which all the rest of the world has already recognized, except the U.S. and Israel, who refuse to even talk to them. One leading Arab diplomat commented firmly, "War is inevitable and imminent." Meanwhile, the U.S. is screaming its head off that the Arabs are all to blame for all the world's woes, and protesting the establishment of Russian naval bases and a doubled Russian navy in the Indian Ocean, which could control or cut off the vast flow of oil from the Persian Gulf in hundreds of tankers plying it daily to the Western world. Even the U.S.'s former oil friends, Iran and Saudi Arabia, have taken a tougher attitude along with the rest of the Muslim world against the rich Jews and Christians who threaten them. The blood and faith of Islam forms an even thicker bond than oil. If you'll just view the map of southern Asia and northern Africa, you'll see how vast and how long and how strong is this combined Arab-Islamic war between Eastern oil and Western greed. And most of the rest of the poor world will sympathize and back these kings of the East as they lead the poor to power, while Western paper empires burn out in overheated friction without Arab oil. When it's all over, and the thick black smoke of the burning oil problem has been blown away by atomic blasts, Mr. Poorman will still be with us to help pick up the pieces and build a new world wherein dwelleth peace, happiness, and plenty for all, as it was in the beginning. So that, my children, is the happy ending of the story of Richman Poorman. Now do you know who's the beggar man or thief? Who'd you rather be, Mr. Richman or Mr. Poorman? I thought so, I would too. For Jesus said, the meek poor man shall inherit the earth and live happily ever after. Will you? Amen.